Most people know Darwin as the man who said, "We come from apes." That sentence captures almost nothing of what Darwin actually did. His real achievement was not a single claim about human ancestry. It was a new way of explaining how complex, functional, seemingly purposeful things come to exist. Before Darwin, the best available explanation for a working eye or a beating heart was an intelligent creator. After Darwin, that explanation became optional, because a purely natural alternative now existed. That shift changed not only biology, but philosophy, theology, ethics, and our understanding of the human mind. This episode will reconstruct Darwin's ideas from the ground up. We will not just cover natural selection, though we will cover it properly. Darwin had a full philosophical vision that extended into morality, aesthetics, human nature, and the logic of scientific reasoning. Much of it remains misunderstood, simplified, or completely ignored in popular treatments. We are going to fix that, one problem at a time. Part 1. The world that needed explaining. To understand what Darwin did, you first need to understand the world he was trying to explain. In the early 1800s, educated Europeans looked at living organisms and saw purpose everywhere. The woodpecker's tongue wraps around its skull and extends deep into bark to extract insects. The orchid's petals are shaped precisely to guide one specific species of bee toward its pollen. The human eye focuses light, adjusts for brightness, and resolves fine detail across enormous distances. These structures do not look accidental. They look engineered. The dominant explanation for this engineering came from a theologian named William Paley. In 1802, Paley published a book called Natural Theology that made a powerful argument. If you found a watch lying on the ground, you would never assume it assembled itself. You would infer a watchmaker because the parts are arranged to serve a purpose. Paley argued that biological organisms display the same kind of purposeful arrangement, only vastly more intricate. Therefore, they too must have a maker, and that maker is God. This was not a lazy argument. Paley spent hundreds of pages documenting specific biological structures with real anatomical detail. He examined joints, muscles, the circulation of blood, and the mechanics of the eye with genuine precision. Darwin himself read Paley as a student at Cambridge and was, by his own account, charmed and fully persuaded. The argument worked because it addressed a real explanatory problem that had no competing solution. Functional complexity appeared to require intentional design, and nobody had shown otherwise. But Paley's argument rested on an unstated assumption that turned out to be vulnerable. It assumed there were only two options for explaining purposeful structures in nature. Either those structures arose from chance, from random parts falling together, or they were designed. Since chance obviously cannot produce a working eye, design wins by elimination. The entire force of the argument depends on those being the only two possibilities. Darwin's contribution was to reveal a third option that Paley never considered. That third option did not require chance, and it did not require a designer. But before Darwin could articulate it, he needed to see something about living things that Paley had missed. He needed to see that organisms within the same species are not copies of one ideal form. They are all different from each other, and those differences matter. Part 2. The Death of the Type. Before Darwin, naturalists classified living things the way a geometer classifies shapes. A triangle is defined by having 3 sides and 3 angles that sum to 180 degrees. Any particular triangle you draw is just an instance of that definition. If one of your triangles has a slightly crooked line, that is an imperfection, not a meaningful feature. The definition is what is real, and individual variations are just noise around the ideal. Naturalists applied the same logic to species. A robin is defined by a set of characteristics: red breast, a certain beak shape, a certain wing length. If one robin has a slightly longer beak than another, that deviation is irrelevant to what a robin is. The type is the real thing, and the variation is mere accident. This way of thinking, later called typological thinking by the biologist Ernst Mayr, has deep roots. It runs back at least to the ancient Greek tendency to look for fixed forms behind the messiness of the visible world. Now, here is the problem Darwin noticed. If you actually sit and measure a population of birds, the variation is not small. Beak lengths differ significantly, even among siblings from the same nest. Body sizes range widely, plumage shades shift from one individual to the next, and behaviours vary. A pigeon breeder in Victorian England knew this intimately. By choosing which birds mated with which, a breeder could produce radically different-looking pigeons within just a few generations. Pouter pigeons with inflated chests, fantails with absurdly spread feathers, tumblers that somersault in flight, all descended from the same wild rock dove. Darwin spent years studying pigeon breeders for precisely this reason. Their work revealed something the typological framework could not accommodate. If variation is just noise around a fixed type, breeding should not be able to push organisms so far from that type. But breeders pushed them enormously far, routinely, in a matter of decades. The variation was not noise, it was raw material. This was Darwin's first conceptual revolution, even before natural selection entered the picture. He inverted the relationship between the type and the variation. In the old framework, the shared features of a species are what is real, and the differences are accidental. In Darwin's framework, the differences between individuals are what is real and consequential. The average is just a statistical summary, an abstraction that does not correspond to any actual organism. No individual robin is the type. Every robin is a unique configuration of inherited traits, and those unique differences are the fuel for change. You are already living inside this insight every time you encounter modern genetics or medicine. When a doctor says a drug works on average but may not work for you, that is population thinking. Your particular genetic makeup is not a deviation from the human type. It is the only reality there is, and the average is the abstraction. But this shift in how we think about variation raised a pressing question. If organisms within a species genuinely differ from one another, and those differences can accumulate through selective breeding, what happens when no human breeder is making the choices? Is there something in nature that plays the role of the pigeon fancier? Part 3. Design without a designer. Darwin had a problem. He could see that organisms vary and that selective breeding exploits that variation to produce change. But nature has no breeder. Nobody is choosing which wolves get to mate or which seeds get to sprout. If change requires selection, and selection requires a chooser, then without a chooser there is no mechanism for change. This is where Darwin was stuck until September of 1838. That month, Darwin read an essay by the English clergyman Thomas Malthus on human population. Malthus had made a stark observation about the arithmetic of reproduction. Human populations tend to grow faster than the food supply that supports them. If left unchecked, any population will outstrip its resources and collapse into famine, disease, or conflict. Malthus was writing about economics and poverty, not about animals, but Darwin saw something in this principle that Malthus himself had not pursued. Consider a single pair of elephants, one of the slowest breeding animals on Earth. Darwin calculated that even elephants, if all their offspring survived and reproduced, would number in the millions within a few centuries. For faster breeding organisms, the numbers become absurd almost immediately. A single cod can lay millions of eggs in one season. Yet the world is not drowning in cod or elephants or any other species. Populations stay roughly stable over time. That means the vast majority of organisms that are born must die before they reproduce. Here is the critical step in the reasoning. Those organisms are not identical to each other, as we established in the previous part. They vary in speed, in disease resistance, in the ability to find food, in the capacity to tolerate cold. If most must die, and they differ from one another, then the ones that die will not be a random sample. On average, over many generations, the individuals whose variations make them slightly better suited to their conditions will survive and reproduce at slightly higher rates. Their traits will be passed to the next generation at slightly higher frequency. Over thousands of generations, this differential survival accumulates into significant change. This is natural selection. Darwin deliberately chose the name to draw a parallel with the artificial selection practiced by pigeon breeders. The breeder chooses which birds mate based on the traits the breeder wants. Nature does the same thing, except the choosing is done by the environment and by death. No mind is required. No plan is required. The process only needs 3 ingredients: variation among individuals, inheritance of that variation by offspring, and a struggle for survival in which some variants do better than others. Notice what has happened to Paley's argument. Paley said the only explanation for purposeful structure in nature is an intelligent designer. Darwin showed there is another possibility: accumulated selection over vast stretches of time. This does not prove there is no designer. It proves that design-like outcomes can arise without one, which is a very different claim. The logical force of Paley's argument depended on there being no alternative to intelligent design. Once a viable alternative exists, the argument from design loses its power as a proof, even if it retains some appeal as an intuition. But there is something about this mechanism that troubled people from the very beginning, and that still troubles many today. Natural selection is slow. It is unimaginably, almost incomprehensibly slow. The question every thoughtful critic immediately asked was, can a process this gradual actually build complex structures like eyes and wings? Part 4. The Slow Knife. Darwin insisted on one principle above almost all others. Nature does not make jumps. The Latin phrase he borrowed was natura non facit saltum, and he repeated it throughout his work. Change happens through the accumulation of tiny increments, each one barely noticeable on its own. No single generation produces a dramatically new organ or a radically different body plan. Each step must be small enough that it represents only a slight modification of what already exists. This commitment to gradualism was not arbitrary. Darwin had a specific reason for insisting on it, rooted in the logic of his own theory. Natural selection can only preserve variations that confer some advantage right now in the current environment. It cannot work toward a future goal. A half-formed wing that cannot yet support flight would seem useless, and useless structures should not be preserved by selection. Therefore, every intermediate stage must be functional in its own right, offering some benefit at each step. That is only possible if each step is very small and connects smoothly to the one before it. Think about what this means in concrete terms. A flat-bodied lizard living in a forest canopy might gain a slight advantage from having an extra flap of skin along its sides. That flap could slow its fall when leaping between branches, reducing the chance of fatal impact. A slightly larger flap would offer slightly more air resistance and be slightly more favoured by selection. Over millions of years, flap becomes membrane, membrane becomes wing surface, and a gliding animal eventually becomes a flying one. No single step in this sequence is a leap from non-flying to flying. Each step is a marginal improvement on the one before it, and each step is independently useful. Darwin's gradualism also explains something about the nature of biological structures that engineers find peculiar. Evolved organs are never designed from scratch the way an engineer would design a machine. They are always modifications of pre-existing structures that originally served a different purpose. The bones in a whale's flipper are the same bones that once formed the leg of a land-walking ancestor. They have been reshaped, compressed, and repurposed, but the underlying architecture is still visible. An engineer designing a flipper from nothing would never use that layout. But evolution does not design from nothing. It tinkers with what is already there, because each modification must be a viable organism at every step. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for Darwin's theory, though it is often overlooked. If organisms were designed from scratch by an intelligent creator, we would expect optimal engineering. Instead, we find awkward workarounds, redundant structures, and remnants of obsolete functions throughout the living world. The human spine, adapted from a structure that originally supported horizontal walking on 4 limbs, causes chronic back pain in millions of upright walkers. That is not what a designer would build, but it is exactly what you would expect from a process that can only modify what already exists. Yet gradualism created a problem that Darwin acknowledged openly and that his critics seized on immediately. Some biological structures seem to have no plausible intermediate stages. The most famous case, which Darwin himself raised before anyone else could, was the eye. But before we deal with that challenge, we need to address another consequence of Darwin's theory that is just as revolutionary. If all organisms are modified versions of earlier organisms, what does that say about the relationships between species? Part 5. One tree, not a ladder. Before Darwin, the most common way to organize living things was a hierarchy of increasing perfection. Minerals at the bottom, then plants, then insects, then fish, then mammals, then humans at the top. This arrangement, sometimes called the Great Chain of Being, had been a fixture of Western thought for centuries. It treated nature as a ladder, with each species occupying a fixed rung. The ladder implied direction, progress, and purpose, with humanity as the inevitable summit. Darwin replaced the ladder with a tree. In his notebook from 1837, he drew one of the most famous diagrams in the history of science. It was a rough sketch of branching lines diverging from a common point, with the words "I think" scrawled above it. This image captured an idea that demolished the ladder entirely. Species are not arranged in a single line from lower to higher. They diverge from shared ancestors like branches splitting from a trunk. The implications of this branching pattern run very deep. On a ladder, every species has a rank, and some species are more advanced than others. On a tree, no living species is more advanced than any other. A modern bacterium has been evolving for exactly as long as a modern human has. Both sit at the tips of branches that extend back to the same root. The bacterium is not a primitive version of us, frozen at an earlier stage of development. It is a fully modern organism, exquisitely adapted to its own way of life, with its own 4-billion-year history of modification. This matters because the ladder view still dominates popular thinking about evolution. People routinely ask why there are still monkeys if humans evolved from them. The question assumes evolution is a ladder, and that becoming human is the next step after being a monkey. On a tree, the question does not even make sense. Humans and modern monkeys share a common ancestor that was neither human nor monkey. The lineage split, and each branch went its own way, shaped by different environments and different selection pressures. Darwin also drew a radical conclusion from the tree that most of his contemporaries found deeply disturbing. If the tree is real, then every living organism on Earth is connected to every other through some chain of ancestry. Humans are not set apart from the rest of nature in any structural sense. We are one twig on a vast bush related by actual descent to oak trees, tapeworms, mushrooms, and bacteria. There is one tree of life, not a separate creation for each kind of being. The tree also explained something that had puzzled naturalists for decades, the pattern of resemblance among species. Why do all mammals have 7 neck vertebrae, whether they are mice or giraffes? On the design view, this makes little sense, because a giraffe's neck serves a very different function from a mouse's. A designer would optimize each neck for its specific purpose. But on the tree view, the answer is straightforward. Mice and giraffes inherited their 7 vertebrae from a shared ancestor, and that number has been conserved ever since, even as everything else around it was modified. Shared ancestry explains shared structure, even when the functions have diverged dramatically. But the tree raised its own difficult question, and Darwin knew it. If complex organs are built gradually by natural selection, one small step at a time, how do you get an organ as complex as the eye through a series of stages that are each independently useful? Darwin called this the most obvious and serious objection to his entire theory. Part 6. The Eye Problem. Darwin wrote that the idea of the eye evolving by natural selection seemed at first absurd in the highest degree. He put this objection in his own voice, in his own book, before any critic could raise it. That act of intellectual honesty is one of the most striking features of the origin of species. Darwin consistently presented the strongest objections to his theory and then attempted to answer them directly. Here is why the eye seems like such a devastating problem. A camera-style eye, like the one humans have, requires many components working together simultaneously. There is a lens to focus light, a retina covered in photoreceptor cells to detect it, an iris to regulate how much light enters, and a neural pathway to carry the signal to the brain. Remove any one of these components and the whole system appears to stop working. If the eye only functions when all the parts are in place, then how could it evolve gradually? What good is half an eye? Darwin's answer came in 2 moves, and both remain valid in modern biology. The first move was to look at the actual eyes that exist in nature across all living species. When you do this, you discover that the animal kingdom contains a complete spectrum of eye complexity. Some single-celled organisms have nothing more than a patch of light-sensitive pigment on their surface. That patch cannot form images, but it can detect whether light is present or absent. For an organism trying to stay in the right depth of water, that information is already useful. Other organisms have the light-sensitive patch sitting inside a shallow cup or depression. The cup provides crude directional information because light from different angles strikes different parts of the cup. You still cannot form an image, but you can now tell which direction light is coming from. That is a meaningful advantage over the flat patch. Deepen the cup further, narrow its opening, and you have a pinhole camera that produces a rough image without any lens at all. The nautilus, a living marine animal, has exactly this kind of eye right now. Add a thin layer of transparent tissue over the opening, and you have a protective covering that also refracts light slightly. Thicken that tissue, curve it, and you get a crude lens that improves the image. Sharpen the lens, add an adjustable iris, increase the density of photoreceptors, and you arrive at the camera eye of a hawk or a human. Every single step in this sequence exists as a functional working eye in some living animal today. Darwin's second move was the logical principle underlying this catalogue of examples. The question, what good is half an eye, assumes that the only function an eye can serve is the one our eye serves. But a 5% eye is better than no eye at all if it lets you detect light and shadow. A 20% eye is better than a 5% eye if it lets you detect the direction of a moving predator. Selection does not need the end product to be useful. It only needs each intermediate stage to be better than the previous one. Modern biology has confirmed Darwin's reasoning with remarkable precision. Researchers have shown that eyes have independently evolved between 40 and 60 separate times across the animal kingdom. This repeated independent emergence of eyes suggests that the evolutionary pathway from light-sensitive cells to complex imaging organs is not only possible but actually quite probable once the basic components are available. The eye problem, then, turned out not to be a flaw in Darwin's theory, but a demonstration of its explanatory power. Yet even as Darwin answered this particular challenge, he was aware of a deeper gap in his theory. Natural selection could explain how functional traits are preserved and accumulated over time, but it could not explain where the variations come from in the first place. Darwin could see that offspring differ from their parents and from each other, but he had absolutely no idea how inheritance actually works at a physical level. Part 7. The Missing Pages. Darwin's theory of natural selection depends on three things: variation, inheritance, and differential survival. By 1859, he had a powerful account of how differential survival shapes populations over time. He had mountains of evidence that variation exists within every species he examined. But on the question of how traits actually pass from parent to offspring, he was essentially guessing. This was not a minor gap. It was a hole at the centre of the theory, and Darwin knew it. If you cannot explain how a parent's advantageous trait gets transmitted to its young, then the entire mechanism of selection is built on an unknown foundation. Critics exploited this relentlessly. The most damaging version of the criticism came from a Scottish engineer named Fleeming Jenkin in 1867. Jenkin pointed out a seemingly fatal problem with any theory of gradual change through selection. Suppose a single individual is born with a useful new trait, say slightly better camouflage. When that individual mates with a normal partner, the prevailing theory of inheritance predicted that their offspring's traits would be a blend of both parents. The useful trait would be diluted by half in the first generation, by a quarter in the next, and so on. Within a few generations, the advantage would be blended away to nothing, like a drop of ink in a glass of water. This was a serious objection, and Darwin had no good answer to it. He actually moved backward under this pressure, increasingly invoking a mechanism closer to the old Lamarckian idea that organisms could pass on traits acquired during their lifetimes. He developed an elaborate and ultimately wrong hypothesis called pangenesis, in which tiny particles from every cell in the body supposedly gathered in the reproductive organs and carried information to the next generation. It was the weakest part of his life's work, and it did not survive scrutiny. The answer to Jenkin's blending problem already existed during Darwin's lifetime, but Darwin never knew about it. In 1866, a monk named Gregor Mendel published the results of his plant breeding experiments in an obscure Austrian journal. Mendel showed that inheritance is not blending at all. Traits are transmitted as discrete units that maintain their identity across generations. A tall pea plant crossed with a short pea plant does not produce a medium plant. It produces tall plants that carry a hidden copy of the short instruction, which can reappear intact in later generations. If inheritance works through discrete units rather than through blending, Jenkins' objection dissolves completely. A useful new variant is not diluted by mating with a normal partner. It is carried as a distinct particle that can be passed on whole, spread through a population, and eventually become common if it confers an advantage. Mendel's discovery was the missing piece that Darwin's theory desperately needed. But Mendel's work was ignored for over 30 years, rediscovered only in 1900. Darwin died in 1882 without ever learning about it. The eventual merger of Mendelian genetics with Darwinian selection, accomplished in the 1930s and 40s, produced what biologists call the modern synthesis. It vindicated Darwin's core insight while correcting his weakest guess. There is something philosophically important about this episode. Darwin built a theory that was fundamentally correct in its logic, even though it was missing a crucial mechanism. He reasoned accurately about the large-scale pattern of evolution, while being completely wrong about the physical details of inheritance. This suggests that the theory of natural selection has a kind of logical independence from any particular account of genetics. The argument works as long as inheritance is accurate enough to transmit advantages, regardless of how that transmission physically occurs. That structural feature is part of what makes Darwin's theory so powerful and so hard to overturn. But natural selection, even properly understood, could not explain everything Darwin observed in the natural world. There was one category of biological trait that seemed to actively work against survival, and it demanded its own explanation. Part 8. Beauty as a Second Engine. In 1860, the year after The Origin of Species was published, Darwin wrote a letter to the American botanist Asa Gray containing a famous confession. He said that the sight of a peacock's tail, whenever he gazed at it, made him feel sick. The peacock's tail is enormous, metabolically expensive to grow, and makes the bird conspicuous to every predator in its environment. By every measure of survival, the tail is a catastrophic liability. If natural selection preserves traits that help organisms survive, the peacock's tail should have been eliminated long ago. Darwin saw this problem clearly, and he recognized it as a genuine limit of natural selection. His solution, developed over the next decade and published in 1871 in The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, was to propose a second evolutionary engine running alongside the first. He called it sexual selection, and it operates by completely different rules. Natural selection is about surviving long enough to reproduce. Sexual selection is about actually getting to reproduce once you have survived. These are two different competitive arenas, and they can pull in opposite directions. A trait that hurts your chances of survival can still spread through a population if it dramatically increases your chances of mating. Darwin divided sexual selection into two mechanisms. The first is competition between members of the same sex, usually males fighting each other for access to mates. This explains antlers on deer, horns on beetles, and the sheer physical bulk of male elephant seals. These are weapons, and the logic behind them is straightforward. Males that win fights mate more often, so traits that help win fights spread through the population. The second mechanism was far more controversial, and it remains provocative today. Darwin proposed that females in many species actively choose their mates based on specific traits they find attractive. The peacock's tail exists not because it helps the peacock survive, but because peahens prefer males with more elaborate tails. The tail is a display organ, and its audience is the female of the species. This idea was ridiculed by many of Darwin's contemporaries, including his close ally Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace argued that attributing aesthetic preferences to female birds and insects gave far too much mental sophistication to creatures with small brains. How could a peahen possibly have a sense of beauty? Darwin's response was characteristically stubborn and empirical. He said it was inconceivable that females showed no preferences whatsoever, given the enormous evidence of elaborate male displays across the animal kingdom. If those displays served no function in attracting mates, why would they exist at all? Modern biology has overwhelmingly vindicated Darwin on this point. Female mate choice has been documented in hundreds of species, from birds to fish to spiders to frogs. Research has shown that females in many species actively evaluate males based on the quality of their songs, the brightness of their colours, or the complexity of their courtship dances. The mechanisms underlying these choices involve sensory systems and neural circuits that respond preferentially to particular kinds of stimulation. But Darwin's theory of sexual selection opened a question he never fully resolved. Why do females prefer certain traits? Is a bright tail feather actually an honest signal of genetic health, meaning that only a vigorous male can afford the cost of maintaining it? Or do female preferences arise for other reasons, perhaps quirks of the sensory system that males then exploit? Darwin leaned toward the idea that females have a genuine aesthetic sense, a taste for the beautiful, as he put it. But he never developed a clear theory of where that taste comes from or how it evolves. That question is still actively debated in evolutionary biology more than 150 years later. Sexual selection also introduced something philosophically unusual into Darwin's framework. Natural selection is blind and mechanical, driven by death and resource scarcity. But sexual selection involves something that looks like preference, evaluation, and choice. It introduces a kind of subjectivity into the evolutionary process, where the perceptions and responses of individual animals partly determine which traits spread through a population. This made Darwin's account of life messier, more psychological, and harder to reduce to simple mechanical principles. And it raised the most explosive question of all. If animal preferences can shape the bodies of other animals over evolutionary time, what happens when you apply this same logic to the most social, most choosy, and most self-aware animal on Earth? What happens when you apply it to humans? Part 9. The Altruism Puzzle. Natural selection rewards traits that help an individual survive and reproduce. Any trait that reduces your own survival or reproductive success should be weeded out, generation by generation, until it disappears. This logic seems airtight, and Darwin believed it. But he also observed behaviors in nature that directly contradict it. Consider a worker bee. She spends her entire life building the hive, feeding larvae, and defending the colony from intruders. When she stings a predator to protect the hive, she dies because her stinger tears from her body. She never reproduces at all. Her entire existence is devoted to helping others breed, while she leaves zero offspring of her own. By the logic of natural selection, this behavior is evolutionary suicide. It should have been eliminated millions of years ago. Darwin called this his one special difficulty and said it initially seemed fatal to his entire theory. If natural selection works on individuals, rewarding those who leave the most offspring, then how can it produce individuals who leave none? The sterile worker bee is not slightly less fit than her sisters. She is completely unfit, reproductively speaking, by choice of biology rather than accident. Darwin's response was to shift the level at which selection operates. He proposed that selection could act on the family rather than on the individual alone. If a queen bee produces some daughters who are sterile workers and others who are fertile, the whole family unit succeeds or fails together. A colony with effective workers outcompetes a colony without them. The genes that produce worker behavior are carried and transmitted by the fertile sisters, not by the workers themselves. Selection is not choosing the individual bee. It is choosing the family lineage that produces the most successful colony. This was a profound intuition, and it was largely correct. But Darwin could not formalize it because he lacked the genetic tools to make it precise. Over 100 years later, in 1964, the biologist William Hamilton provided the mathematical framework. Hamilton showed that a gene promoting self-sacrifice can spread through a population if the cost to the individual is outweighed by the benefit to relatives who share that gene. The closer the relative, the more copies of the gene they are likely to share, and the more it pays, genetically speaking, to sacrifice for them. This principle, now called kin selection, resolved Darwin's special difficulty with striking precision. Worker bees share an unusually high proportion of their genes with their sisters due to the peculiar way bees inherit genetic material. A worker who helps her mother queen produce more sisters is actually spreading her own genes more effectively than if she reproduced directly. The apparent self-sacrifice is, at the genetic level, a form of self-interest. But Darwin's engagement with self-sacrifice did not stop at insects. He was also fascinated by the fact that humans routinely help strangers, risk their lives for their communities, and feel guilty when they fail to do so. Kin selection cannot explain why a soldier dies for a nation of millions of unrelated people. Darwin's attempt to explain human morality required him to push his theory into the most contested territory of all, the origin of conscience. Part 10. Where conscience comes from. In The Descent of Man, Darwin made a claim that his contemporaries found more disturbing than anything in The Origin of Species. He said that of all the differences between humans and other animals, the moral sense is the most important. And then he argued that even this most human of qualities is a product of evolution. The conventional view in Darwin's time was that conscience is the voice of God, planted in the human soul and irreducible to any natural explanation. Darwin's opponents conceded that the human body might share ancestry with animals. But morality, they insisted, required a creator. No natural process could produce a sense of right and wrong, of obligation and guilt. Darwin built his case in stages. The first step was to establish that social animals already display something resembling moral behavior long before humans enter the picture. He catalogued examples across the animal kingdom: dogs defending their masters at personal risk, monkeys grooming and protecting each other, elephants staying beside an injured companion instead of fleeing. These are not moral acts in the full human sense, but they show that the raw material for morality, the tendency to act for the benefit of others, already exists in non-human animals. Darwin's second step was to identify the psychological foundation of this behavior. He argued that the social instincts, the innate drive to seek out companions, to feel distress at separation, to take pleasure in the presence of others, are the bedrock on which morality is built. These instincts evolved because social animals that cooperated and aided each other survived better than those that did not. A troop of baboons that bands together against a leopard fares better than a troop of loners. The third step was crucial and distinctly Darwinian. He proposed that conscience emerges when social instincts collide with other, more selfish impulses inside the same mind. A man walking past a drowning stranger feels the pull to help, but also the pull to protect himself from danger. If he walks past and does nothing, the social instinct, which is persistent and deeply seated, continues to nag at him long after the selfish impulse has faded. That lingering dissatisfaction, that retrospective sense of having violated something important, is what Darwin identified as the origin of conscience. It is not the voice of God. It is the voice of a deep social instinct that refuses to stay silent after being overridden by a momentary impulse. Darwin added a fourth element that prevented his theory from collapsing into mere instinct. He argued that as intellectual powers increase, an animal can reflect on its own past behavior and compare it with what it now knows about the consequences. In humans, this reflective capacity combines with language, which allows moral rules to be taught, discussed, refined, and transmitted across generations. The moral sense begins in biology, but it is elaborated and diversified by culture. This is why different societies have different moral codes, even though the underlying capacity for moral feeling is universal. Darwin was trying to bridge two traditions in moral philosophy that he had read as a young man. One tradition, associated with thinkers who emphasize consequences, said morality is about producing the greatest good for the greatest number. The other tradition, associated with thinkers who emphasized innate feeling, said morality comes from a built-in moral sense that operates independently of calculation. Darwin believed his evolutionary account united these two views. The moral sense is innate, in the sense that social instincts are inherited. But the social instincts evolved precisely because they promote the welfare of the community, which is the consequentialist insight. This account has a real limitation that Darwin partially acknowledged. It explains why we have moral feelings, but it is far less clear whether it can justify any particular moral claim. Showing that guilt evolved because it helped ancestral groups survive does not prove that the things we feel guilty about are actually wrong. The evolutionary origins of a belief tell you where it came from, not whether it is true. This gap between explaining morality and grounding it remains one of the deepest open problems in philosophy, and Darwin left it unresolved. Part 11. The Animal in the Mirror. Darwin's entire treatment of human evolution in The Descent of Man rests on a single, relentlessly applied principle. The difference between humans and other animals is one of degree, not of kind. Every capacity that seems to set humans apart, including reason, language, aesthetic sense, and moral feeling, has at least a rudimentary form in some other animal. This principle needed defending because the obvious objection is devastating in its simplicity. Humans build cathedrals, write symphonies, prove mathematical theorems, and debate the meaning of justice. No other animal does anything remotely comparable. The gap between the most intelligent ape and the dullest human appears not just large, but categorically different. Darwin's strategy was to fill that gap with a continuous gradient of examples. He pointed to tool use in primates, to the way young crows drop nuts in front of passing cars to crack them, though he used similar examples from his own era. He described dogs that appeared to dream, to show jealousy, and to exhibit something resembling a sense of humour. He noted that many animals communicate alarm, desire, and aggression through vocal signals that differ across populations, which is at least a precursor to language. None of these capacities match the human version in complexity, but Darwin argued that the human versions are elaborations of the same underlying faculties, built up by the same evolutionary processes over a much longer period. The philosophical core of this argument is about where you draw the line between categories. If you insist on a hard boundary between animals and humans, you need to identify the precise capacity that exists entirely in us and entirely not in them. Darwin systematically examined every candidate for that boundary and showed that each one leaked. Reason exists in rudimentary form in problem-solving animals. Emotion exists in animals that grieve, play, and display attachment. Even self-awareness, which many considered the ultimate human distinction, could not be confidently denied to the higher primates, who display behavior suggesting some degree of self-recognition. Darwin pushed this point further than most of his contemporaries were willing to follow. He argued that even religious feeling has its roots in animal cognition. A dog that cowers and whimpers during a thunderstorm, imagining some unseen power behind the noise, is exhibiting the same cognitive pattern that underlies human superstition and, ultimately, religious belief. He was not claiming that dogs have theology. He was claiming that the tendency to attribute agency to unexplained phenomena, the tendency that eventually produces theology in beings with sufficient intellect, is already present in simpler form in other animals. This dissolution of the human-animal boundary has been one of Darwin's most consequential legacies. It reshaped law, ethics, and the way we think about animal welfare. If the difference is one of degree rather than kind, then the suffering of a chimpanzee or a dog is not categorically different from human suffering. The cognitive sciences have largely confirmed Darwin's intuition, finding continuity rather than sharp breaks across species in areas including memory, emotion, social learning, and rudimentary problem-solving. But Darwin's commitment to continuity between humans and animals also led him into deeply problematic territory. Because if all humans share ancestry with apes, and if intelligence and civilization vary by degree, it was a short step to ranking different human populations on a scale from lower to higher. Darwin took that step, and the consequences require honest examination. Part 12. Darwin on Race. Darwin lived in an era when the scientific mainstream assumed that human races represented a hierarchy of development. He did not invent this assumption, but he did embed it in his evolutionary framework, and the result is one of the most troubling parts of his legacy. First, the elements Darwin got right, and they are significant. He argued forcefully that all human races descend from a single common ancestor, a position called monogenism. This put him in direct opposition to polygenists, who claimed that different races were created separately and constituted different species. Polygenism was the favoured theory of many scientific racists of the time, including the prominent American naturalist Louis Agassiz. Darwin rejected it on both scientific and moral grounds. He predicted that once evolution was broadly accepted, the debate between monogenists and polygenists would die a quiet death, and he was right. Darwin also insisted that racial characteristics are not fixed. Like all traits, they vary continuously and change over time in response to conditions. He attributed much of the visible difference between human populations to sexual selection, arguing that different groups developed different standards of physical beauty, and that preferences for certain features in mates gradually shaped the appearance of each population. This was a naturalistic explanation for racial variation that did not require separate origins or inherent biological destiny. Now the elements Darwin got wrong, and they are equally significant. Despite arguing for common descent, Darwin repeatedly ranked human populations on a scale of civilizational development and treated that ranking as reflecting something about biological capacity. In The Descent of Man, he described indigenous Australians and peoples of Tierra del Fuego in terms that reduced them to intermediaries between apes and Europeans. He wrote casually about what he called the extermination of savage races by civilized ones, treating this as a natural and predictable consequence of evolutionary competition. He did not celebrate this outcome, but he described it with a detachment that is chilling to a modern reader. The intellectual error here is specific and worth isolating, because it is not a necessary consequence of Darwin's theory. Darwin conflated technological and institutional development with biological advancement. A society that builds factories is not composed of biologically superior individuals compared to a society that hunts and gathers. Technological complexity depends on accumulated cultural knowledge, resource access, geography, and historical accident, none of which track individual genetic capacity. Darwin's own theory should have made this clear, since he understood that adaptation is local and that fitness is relative to a specific environment. A trait that is advantageous in one context may be irrelevant or harmful in another. Darwin was a passionate abolitionist who was horrified by the cruelties of slavery he witnessed in Brazil during the Beagle voyage. He fought bitterly with the Beagle's captain over the morality of slaveholding. His commitment to the unity of the human species was partly motivated by his opposition to the dehumanization of enslaved people. But his personal decency on this front did not prevent him from absorbing the hierarchical assumptions of Victorian anthropology and naturalizing them through his theory. The honest conclusion is that Darwin's theory does not require or support racial hierarchy, but Darwin himself did not consistently see this. He applied his framework rigorously when it came to beetles and barnacles, but applied it sloppily when it came to human populations, importing the prejudices of his class and era into what should have been a more careful analysis. This failure is worth acknowledging plainly, not to diminish Darwin, but to demonstrate that even the most powerful thinkers can be captured by assumptions they fail to examine. Part 13. The Heredity Gap. We covered the blending problem and Mendel's solution earlier, but Darwin's failure to understand heredity had consequences beyond any single objection. It distorted his later thinking in ways that weakened his own best ideas. Without a correct theory of inheritance, Darwin could not explain how new variations arise in the first place. He knew they existed because he could see them in every population he studied. But he had no mechanism for their production. This left a vacuum at the center of his theory that pulled him toward explanations he should have rejected. As Darwin aged, he increasingly relied on a Lamarckian mechanism, the idea that organisms can pass on traits they acquire during their lifetimes. A blacksmith who developed strong arms by years of hammering would, on this view, produce children with slightly stronger arms. Darwin never fully abandoned natural selection, but he gave more and more weight to this inheritance of acquired characteristics in successive editions of The Origin of Species. Each new edition moves slightly further from the clarity of the original, muddied by Darwin's attempts to patch the heredity gap with mechanisms that do not work. His most elaborate attempt to solve the problem was a hypothesis he called pangenesis, published in 1868. Darwin proposed that every cell in the body sheds tiny particles called gemmules, which circulate through the body and collect in the reproductive organs. These gemmules carry information about the current state of each cell, allowing changes that occur during a parent's lifetime to be transmitted to offspring. The theory was ingenious, completely wrong, and immediately criticized by Darwin's own allies. His cousin Francis Galton tested pangenesis by transfusing blood between rabbits of different colors and checking whether the offspring showed any mixing. They did not. The deeper lesson here is about the structure of Darwin's theory. Natural selection turned out to be remarkably robust. It survived the total replacement of Darwin's understanding of heredity with Mendelian genetics, and later with molecular biology. The selection mechanism does not care how inheritance works at the physical level. It only requires that offspring resemble their parents more than they resemble random members of the population. As long as that condition holds, selection can operate, regardless of whether the underlying mechanism is gemmules, genes, or anything else. This modularity is part of what makes Darwin's theory so unusual in the history of science. Most scientific theories are tightly bound to specific physical mechanisms, and when those mechanisms are overturned, the theory falls with them. Darwin's central insight was abstract enough to survive a complete revolution in its supporting science. That structural feature tells us something important about the kind of idea natural selection is. It is not a specific physical hypothesis. It is a logical relationship between variation, inheritance, and differential success that holds wherever those three conditions are met, in any medium, biological or otherwise. Part 14. The Death of Purpose. The philosophical impact of Darwin's theory reaches far beyond biology. Its deepest consequence is the elimination of purpose as a fundamental feature of the natural world. Before Darwin, the default assumption across most of Western thought was that nature is organized around purposes. An acorn exists to become an oak tree. The heart exists to pump blood. The eye exists to see. These purposes were considered real features of the world, built into the fabric of things, either by God or by some inherent natural tendency toward order. Philosophers call this view teleology, from the Greek word for end or goal. Darwin's theory provides an entirely different explanation for why organisms appear to have purposes. The heart pumps blood not because it was designed to do so, but because ancestors whose hearts pump blood effectively left more offspring than ancestors whose hearts did not. The function is real. The organ genuinely does pump blood, and that function genuinely contributes to the organism's survival. But the explanation for why this function exists does not require anyone or anything to have intended it. The appearance of purpose is generated by a purposeless process operating over enormous spans of time. This matters philosophically because purpose was one of the primary bridges between the natural world and the supernatural. If eyes are designed to see, there must be a designer who intended sight. Darwin did not prove that no designer exists, but he showed that the appearance of design can be generated without one, which severs the logical link between biological complexity and divine intention. The reach of this idea extends far beyond theology. You encounter it whenever you use a machine learning system that produces sophisticated outputs without anyone programming the specific result. A language model generates coherent sentences not because it understands meaning, but because a selection-like process during training reinforced patterns that produce useful outputs. The result looks purposeful. The process that produced it is not. This is a thoroughly Darwinian structure, and it pervades modern technology without most people recognizing the connection. Darwin himself was ambivalent about the full implications of this idea. He sometimes wrote as though natural laws themselves might have been designed by God, even if the specific outcomes were not. This allowed him to remove God from the details while preserving a role for God in the framework. But he also recognized that this position was unstable. If the laws of nature are sufficient to produce everything we see, including human intelligence and moral feeling, then invoking a designer of those laws starts to look like an unnecessary addition rather than a required explanation. The philosopher Daniel Dennett later described natural selection as a universal acid, a concept so corrosive that it eats through every container you try to hold it in. Once you accept that purpose can arise from purposelessness in biology, the same logic threatens to extend to the mind, to culture, to morality, and to meaning itself. Darwin opened that door, but never walked all the way through it. The question of what happens to human meaning in a universe without inherent purpose remains one of the defining problems of modern philosophy. Part 15. Darwin and God. Darwin's religious views changed slowly over his lifetime, and he was more honest about that process than most public figures of his era. Understanding what happened to his faith matters because it reveals how he handled the collision between his scientific conclusions and his deepest personal commitments. As a young man at Cambridge in the late 1820s, Darwin was studying to become an Anglican clergyman. He read Paley's Natural Theology with genuine admiration and found its arguments persuasive. During the Beagle voyage in the early 1830s, he was, by his own account, quite orthodox in his Christianity. Fellow officers aboard the ship laughed at him for citing the Bible as a moral authority, not because they disagreed with the Bible, but because they found his earnestness amusing. The erosion began gradually, driven by multiple forces. Darwin became troubled by the historical claims of the Old Testament, which he came to see as no more reliable than the sacred texts of any other culture. He was disturbed by the doctrine of eternal damnation, which condemned his own father and brother, neither of whom were believers, to an eternity of punishment. He later wrote that he could hardly see how anyone should wish Christianity to be true, given that its plain language seems to condemn the majority of humanity. But it was not theology alone that moved him. The problem of suffering pressed on Darwin with specific personal force. In 1851, his daughter Annie died at the age of 10, probably from tuberculosis. Darwin was devastated. Years later, he still wept when he recalled her. Annie's death did not by itself destroy his faith, but it made the idea of a benevolent, all-powerful God much harder to sustain. His scientific work added a different kind of pressure. The more Darwin studied the natural world, the more cruelty he found woven into its basic fabric. Parasitic wasps that lay their eggs inside living caterpillars so that the larvae eat the host alive from the inside out struck him as particularly incompatible with benevolent design. He wrote that he could not persuade himself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have purposefully created such organisms. By the 1870s, Darwin described himself as an agnostic, a term his friend Thomas Huxley had recently invented. He was careful to distinguish this from atheism. He never denied the existence of God outright, and he stated explicitly that he had never been an atheist in the sense of positively denying a creator, but he also could not affirm one. His position was genuine uncertainty, complicated by a further doubt that cut even deeper. Darwin raised a question that is rarely discussed, but philosophically profound. If the human mind evolved from the mind of a lower animal, through a process that selects for survival rather than for truth, can we trust that mind when it draws grand metaphysical conclusions? Can a brain built by natural selection to find food and avoid predators be relied upon to determine whether God exists? Darwin did not answer this question. He said the mystery of the beginning of all things was insoluble, and that he must be content to remain an agnostic. This is a remarkable position for several reasons. Darwin did not use his theory to argue against God, even though many of his followers did exactly that. Instead, he used his theory to undermine confidence in the human capacity to settle the question at all. His agnosticism was not laziness or evasion. It was a consequence of applying his own theory to the instrument doing the reasoning. Part 16. How Darwin Thought. Darwin's method of reasoning deserves attention because it was unusual for his time and remains instructive. He was not primarily a laboratory experimenter, though he conducted many experiments. He was not a mathematician, though his theory has deep mathematical implications. He was something harder to categorize. A patient accumulator of diverse evidence who built enormous arguments by weaving together observations from fields that other scientists kept separate. The Origin of Species draws on geology, embryology, biogeography, paleontology, anatomy, animal breeding, and behavioral observation. No previous scientific work had attempted to unify evidence from so many domains into a single explanatory framework. Darwin's argumentative strategy, influenced by the philosopher of science William Whewell, relied on what Whewell called a consilience of inductions. The idea is that a theory gains credibility not just from the evidence that originally suggested it, but from its ability to explain facts drawn from completely independent domains that the theory was never designed to address. Consider how Darwin used biogeography. Why do the Galapagos Islands, which are volcanic and have never been connected to the South American mainland, have finch species that closely resemble mainland South American finches but differ from island to island? On the creation view, there is no good reason for this pattern. A designer could put any species anywhere. On the common descent view, the pattern is exactly what you would expect if a small founding population arrived from the mainland and then diversified in isolation on each island. Darwin stacked hundreds of such patterns on top of each other until the weight of convergent explanation became overwhelming. Darwin also had an extraordinary discipline of seeking out objections to his own ideas. He kept what he called a golden rule. Whenever he encountered a fact that seemed to contradict his theory, he would immediately write it down, because he had noticed that his mind was otherwise inclined to forget such facts. This practice was not mere intellectual humility. It was a deliberate cognitive strategy to counteract the confirmation bias that he recognized in himself. His notebooks reveal a mind that tested ideas by pushing them to their most extreme and uncomfortable conclusions. When he first began thinking about evolution, he immediately saw that it applied to humans, to morality, and to the mind itself. He did not publish these thoughts for over 20 years, in part because he understood the social and intellectual upheaval they would cause. But he never stopped developing them privately. The delay was not timidity. It was the discipline of a thinker who wanted his evidence to be so comprehensive that the conclusion would be nearly inescapable when he finally presented it. There is also something distinctive about Darwin's relationship to uncertainty. He was comfortable with not knowing in a way that many scientists and most public intellectuals are not. He published his theory with a massive gap at its center, the problem of heredity, and openly acknowledged that gap rather than papering over it. He admitted the force of objections he could not answer, including the eye problem and the altruism puzzle, and trusted that future work would either resolve them or reveal genuine limits of his theory. This willingness to hold a powerful framework and a set of unsolved problems simultaneously, without either abandoning the framework or pretending the problems do not exist, is one of the rarest intellectual virtues. Part 17. What Darwin broke and what he left broken. Darwin's theory shattered several assumptions that had organized Western thought for centuries. It is worth stating plainly what was broken and what remains unrepaired. First, Darwin broke the argument from design as a proof of God's existence. Before 1859, the complexity of living organisms was the single strongest piece of evidence for a creator. After 1859, it was not, because a viable naturalistic alternative existed. This does not mean the design argument has no remaining appeal, but it can no longer function as a logical proof in the way Paley intended it. Second, Darwin broke the special status of human beings in the natural order. Humans are not a separate creation set apart from the rest of life. They are one species among millions, connected by actual lines of descent to every other living thing. The mental and moral capacities that seem to distinguish us from animals differ in degree, not in kind, from capacities visible elsewhere in the animal kingdom. Whether or not you find this disturbing depends on what you built on the assumption of human separateness, but the factual claim is no longer seriously contested. Third, Darwin broke the idea that nature has inherent purposes. Organisms appear designed, but that appearance is generated by blind selection rather than intentional planning. Purpose, in the traditional sense of an end toward which things are directed by some intelligence, is not required to explain biological complexity. This remains one of the hardest Darwinian conclusions for human psychology to absorb, because our minds are wired to see intention and purpose everywhere, including where none exists. Fourth, Darwin broke the stability of species. The idea that a species is a fixed eternal category defined by an essence that does not change was replaced by the idea that species are populations of variable individuals, constantly shifting under the pressure of selection and drift. This seemingly technical point has profound implications for how we think about categories in general, from race to gender to mental illness. If biological kinds are not fixed, the boundary around any category is always somewhat arbitrary, and always subject to revision. Now, what did Darwin leave broken? He left the problem of meaning wide open. If the universe contains no inherent purposes, and if the human mind is a product of a process that selects for survival rather than for truth, then the foundations of meaning, value, and moral obligation become genuinely uncertain. Darwin did not solve this problem. He may have made it permanently harder to solve by removing the most popular solutions that preceded him. He left the relationship between evolution and ethics unresolved. His account explains why we have moral feelings, but it cannot tell us whether those feelings track anything real beyond their own evolutionary origins. The question of whether evolved moral intuitions give us access to genuine moral truths, or whether they are merely useful fictions installed by natural selection, is still debated by philosophers with no consensus in sight. He left the question of consciousness completely untouched. Darwin could explain how brains evolved, and why more complex brains conferred survival advantages. But he had nothing to say about why any brain produces subjective experience at all, about why there is something it is like to be a bat or a human rather than nothing. Natural selection explains the functions of the brain, but is silent on the existence of inner experience. This remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in science and philosophy. And he left a warning that applies beyond biology. Darwin showed that a process with no foresight and no intelligence can produce outcomes of staggering complexity and apparent design. That insight now applies to markets, to cultures, to languages, and to technologies that evolve through selection-like dynamics their creators do not fully control. The world we inhabit is increasingly shaped by processes that have Darwinian structure, blind variation, environmental filtering, differential reproduction of ideas and products and institutions. Understanding Darwin is not just a matter of understanding biology. It is a matter of understanding the logic that governs any system in which these three conditions are met. And that, it turns out, includes almost everything.